Hey everyone, Erick Stakelbeck here. Welcome to a Watchman Newscast live stream. My apologies, I was 2 minutes late, 4:02 Eastern Time, um, PM here in the United States. I wanted to go at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. Busy day. I just did a great interview with a good friend of mine from the UK. His name is Simon Barrett. He hosts a variety of shows on Revelation TV, a Christian TV network based out of the UK. And we did a long interview. Maybe he'll put it on YouTube. I'm not sure. But about 45 minutes we talked about all the issues, and I talked a bit about my testimony and life story, which I've shared a little bit here on the newscast in the past, which I know everyone liked to hear. And maybe I'll share a little bit of that today. Some of the experiences that shaped me growing up in Philly, and also following the Lord and giving my life to the Lord, and the adventure I've been on since doing that. But let's get into adventures, or misadventures, I should say, today. We've got some breaking news to get right into. Remember, bring your questions. We're going for a full hour here till I guess 5:02 p.m. Eastern Time, since I was 2 minutes late. But we're going to go for a full hour. Bring your questions for the last at least 15 minutes of the show, of the newscast today. We will be answering your questions. My trusty producer, Daniel, has the list. And once in a while, you will see me look down at my phone because he's texting me or emailing me some questions. And I also have the scroll here. I can see the chat going on right now. Hello, everyone from around the world. We have people joining us: Nigeria, Ohio, Chicago, London. Okay, we're off to a great start here. But the Q&A coming up. Also, quick programming note real quick before we start. Remember, I announced yesterday on the newscast, we're doing a live stream once per week now. We were doing every 2 weeks, usually every other Thursday, sometimes on Wednesdays, but now we will go once per week live like this, probably every Thursday. Again, sometimes a Wednesday, depending on my schedule. I coach my daughter in basketball, so that also could impact things. Priorities, come on, but have a lot of fun doing that. But let's get into it. Not a lot of fun in the Middle East right now. A few major events we want to talk about. Number one, overnight, we had airstrikes in Syria yet again, in central Syria. The Iranian axis, Iran and its radical allies, jihadist allies, are blaming Israel for these airstrikes. They are vowing, quote, a very harsh response. I don't want to misquote them. A very harsh response in a statement. We'll talk about that in a minute, the ramifications. Secondly, you all have probably seen, we have some real keen observers of the Middle East who join us here on the live streams. You bring great questions to us. So you all have probably seen what's unfolded in Lebanon today at a Hezbollah rally in the Lebanese capital, Beirut. People killed, wounded, violence broke out there. Is Lebanon on the edge of civil war yet again? Remember the 1970s, 80s, 90s in that country, the madness, the chaos that tore that once beautiful nation apart, in particular Beirut. There's still so much natural beauty in Lebanon, and I love the Lebanese people, but there's been such chaos there over the past several decades. Are we right now on the precipice of yet another factional civil war? Shia, Sunnis, Christians there in Lebanon. Hey, that country has been having massive struggles over the past 14 months or so since that Beirut port blast. We'll talk about that today. Also, Israel's foreign minister, Yair Lapid, is in the United States right now as I come to you on Thursday, October 14th for this live stream. He's meeting with Biden administration officials. And surprise, surprise, the conversation is centering around, you guessed it, Iran's nuclear weapons program. That's happening, and some interesting takeaways from these meetings that I'll share with you. Another thing to discuss, if we have time, and I'm guessing we might get into this more in the Q&A at the end, because it seems on our live stream Q&As that our viewers love to talk about Ezekiel 38, the book of Ezekiel, chapters 38 and 39, the coming Gog Magog war. I don't say they love to talk about it. That's not the right name to use. But hey, people are interested, intrigued by it, because the watchmen and women on the wall who are watching us here they know the signs and they know the times, and they see that coming conflict, the war of Gog and Magog, at the doorstep. So along those lines, Naftali Bennett, the Israeli prime minister, is meeting. Oh, by the way, Ishbel McBoyle from North Scotland says shalom. Thank you, too. I just found out I have some Scottish blood in me, Ishbel. So Irish, Scottish, English, German, Northern, Western Europe is kind of my lineage. But Naftali Bennett, had to say that since I saw a Scot commenting on the chat here. But Naftali Bennett, the Israeli prime minister, meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin next week in Russia. Putin extended the invite. Very interesting. Now, Netanyahu, obviously, the former Israeli prime minister, had a pretty close relationship, at least on the surface, with Putin. Close in terms of, look, Netanyahu met with Putin more than any other world leader. Now it's kind of a fresh slate here, and Naftali Bennett will have to establish some sort of relationship with Putin, a man not to be trusted, to say the least. In my view, it will be the first time Bennett meets with Putin as prime minister. I'd imagine the two may have met in previous years when Bennett served as defense minister, perhaps. But nevertheless, they're meeting in Russia later next week. That's a big meeting, folks, and may have some prophetic ramifications. They're going to talk about Iran. Everyone's talking about Iran, and for good reason. We'll talk about it in a second. They will also talk about Syria, where Russia and Israel are kind of at loggerheads a bit on the past few months. We've been talking about it here in the newscast. Russia is growing increasingly agitated with Israeli airstrikes against Iranian and Hezbollah and Assad regime assets inside Syria, which is where we are going to start today. I mentioned those airstrikes last night. Let's start there with a reminder. One more topic. There's so much going on. The Middle East never sleeps, right? What about Iran's Iron Dome? Now, we know about Israel's Iron Dome, but Iran this week conducted some military drills. They're saying they have their own version of the Iron Dome missile defense system. We got a lot to talk about in the next hour, so let's get into it. Let's start again with those airstrikes overnight. Airstrikes took place in central Syria, in the city of Palmyra. That name may sound familiar. Palmyra was a place a few years back when ISIS was running roughshod over the eastern half of Syria, the central and eastern half of Syria. They blew up some Roman artifacts and archaeological sites in Palmyra, ancient sites that were at least 2,000 years old. ISIS destroyed them. Surprise, surprise. They destroyed everything in their path. But Palmyra kind of was on the map in a lot of people's minds because of that. Well, there is a heavy now. ISIS may have been smashed largely in Syria and Iraq. The caliphate has been smashed, but Iran and those Shia militias, those Iranian-backed militias, have moved in to where ISIS was. That includes around Palmyra, and there were airstrikes in the middle of the night, overnight, Thursday early morning, October 14th, in which at least 9 Iranian-backed fighters were killed, according to Syrian sources reporting out of the Middle East. Among those fighters were some Syrians, perhaps Syrian military, but the other were apparently various Iranian-backed militia members. They were killed in these airstrikes. A communications tower was targeted in these strikes as well. This follows an event we discussed here on the Watchman Newscast just about a week ago. Similar airstrikes around that same area in central Syria. More and more of these airstrikes as of late have been concentrated on central Syria and eastern Syria, actually near the Iraq border, which is a ways to go for Israeli fighter jets and drones, to say the least. But what Israel is trying to do is kind of head Iran off at the pass. Why is Iran in Syria, and why is Israel striking them there? Number one, Iran wants to drive all the way to Israel's Golan Heights and establish a beachhead there from which it can launch attacks against Israel. They want to duplicate what they have in southern Lebanon right now in the form of Hezbollah. Number two, Iran is using Syria to transit those precision-guided missiles, PGMs for short, across Syria into the hands of Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. Israel says, no way, red line, we will not let you cross it. So Israel has conducted hundreds, if not thousands, of airstrikes against Iranian assets inside Syria, really over the past decade, since the Syrian civil war started in 2011. Iran had a strategy all along, folks. They knew they wanted to set up shop in Syria, and in Iran's mind, in the minds of the Iranian regime, They are in Syria to stay. Israel says, think again. This week, Naftali Bennett, the Israeli prime minister, gave an important speech about the Golan Heights. We talked about this on the Watchman Newscast. Gosh, it was either Monday or Tuesday earlier this week. Check it out in our archives here on YouTube. Hey, if you're just joining us, by the way, we're about 10 minutes in, I guess. You can catch the first 10 minutes, anything you missed. Also, because we will post this live stream under newscasts on our Watchman YouTube channel. If you haven't subscribed, shame on you. Just kidding. But if you haven't subscribed, be sure to subscribe while you're there. We are bringing you the inside story on the world's most pivotal region, the Middle East, and how it affects you, no matter where you live around the world. The prophetic chess pieces are indeed moving. And by the way, we're close to 400,000 subscribers now. Would love to see you all push us over that number, 400K. Pretty cool, pretty exciting. Tomorrow's October 15th. October 15th, 2020, we hit 100,000. Now, tomorrow, October 15th, 2021, we're on the doorstep of 400,000. That's some phenomenal growth in the past year. It's all because of God Almighty, number one. All credit to him. And number two, you, all of our viewers and subscribers for watching. You have helped build us up and expand our territory for such a time as this. We're trying to bring you the truth every single day here on the Watchman Newscast. And we believe God will honor that. And we believe that you will honor that by tuning in every day. So thank you, everyone. Hey, but the Bennett speech about the Golan, very important. He said that Iran is attempting to build an army on the Golan Heights. I am directly quoting the Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. They're attempting to build an army on the Golan, literally on the Israel-Syria border. One of my favorite places in Israel. I have filmed there many times for the Watchmen. Beautiful, scenic. Bennett said, we will not allow it, number one. Number two, and this was fascinating, folks. He said that Israel is going to build on the Golan. They want a population, no pun intended, explosion, probably not the best word to use there, on the Golan Heights. Israel wants to quadruple the population on the Golan, build it up economically, infrastructure. That is incredible news. Again, as I said, I love the Golan Heights. What a beautiful area. A dear friend of mine who I work with on the Watchmen TV show recently moved from Jerusalem to the Golan. He said, Erick, this is a great place to raise a family. You're up in the mountains, beautiful scenery, fresh air. And a lot of Israelis, I think, will follow suit. Remember, not only is there a government plan and initiative now to build up the Golan Heights, but remember, the Golan was historically a part of the land of Israel. On the newscast this week, that newscast I mentioned about this Bennett speech on the Golan, I featured a clip from the Watchmen TV show that we filmed at an ancient synagogue in the Golan, 2,000 years old. So needless to say, there has been a Jewish presence there in that region for millennia. And guess what? The Iranian regime wants to eliminate that Jewish presence on the Golan. Israel says no, and that's why we see these airstrikes. Now, a quick point to mention here that's very important, because these airstrikes last night, this could lead to some bigger fireworks. An entity calling itself the Syria Allies Operations Room. That's right, the Syria Allies Operation Room. They released a statement after these airstrikes in Palmyra late last night, and they vowed, quote, a very harsh response against Israel. Now, they also attacked the United States, but they seem to be fingering Israel as the main culprit behind last night's airstrikes. Of course, Israel has not claimed responsibility. That is the MO for the Israel Defense Forces. 9 times out of 10, they won't say a word. They won't claim any responsibility for these strikes. And that was the case here as well. But this Syria Allies Operations Room, they're not trying to hear that. And they're saying they will retaliate harshly. What does that mean? Keep your eyes peeled, folks, over the next few days. The Middle East right now is an absolute tinderbox. And the slightest provocation, the slightest small incident could spark a broader regional war. I would advise this Syria Allies Operation Room to be very careful and tread lightly in how they respond, because we've seen in past instances Drones flown from Syria into Israeli territory. I'm thinking about February 2018. Even missiles fired from Syria at northern Israel by Iran in May 2018. I was actually there in Israel on the ground when that happened in May 2018. It was the same week when the U.S. Embassy moved to Jerusalem, where it belongs, where it always belonged. But there can be miscalculations, to say the least, by the Iranian regime and its allies there in Syria. And in both of those situations that I mentioned, February 2018 and May 2018, they were acts of war by the Iranian regime, no doubt. Israel responded with overwhelming force and just massively bombarded the Iranian military and terror infrastructure inside Syria with heavy, heavy airstrikes. So I would advise these Iranian allies to tread lightly as they plan and plot their, quote, very harsh response against Israel. What was interesting about this as well is not only did the response seems to come from the north, but Hamas also had some critical words as well about Israel's transgressions. But this is mainly concentrated from the north, these threats coming from, I presume, Hezbollah, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, and their various Syrian militia allies operating there in Syria at Israel's northeastern doorstep. So let's keep a very close eye on this. Israel certainly is. Israel, after these airstrikes last night and after these threats by Iran and its proxies, closed the airspace over the Golan Heights. Now, it's a precautionary measure. Israel has done this several times in the past in the wake of any kind of airstrikes or military dust-up in Syria. They've done it once again. So be on the lookout for rockets, drones, and Iran, again, folks, as you know, if you watch a newscast on a regular basis, and if you understand the region and how the Iranian regime operates, always operating through proxy, through Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the militias in Iraq and Syria, Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen, always operating through proxies. And the other brand of retaliation that the Iranian regime often uses is to strike out against Israeli embassies, consulates, and Jewish targets like synagogues and community centers worldwide. Not only striking Israel proper, the nation of Israel, but striking what the Iranian regime considers softer targets, like an embassy, a consulate. But hey, I'll tell you, if you've been in Israeli embassies like I have, or London, Brussels, DC, many times, they're not soft targets, to say the least. They are heavily, heavily secured. And it's sad that it has to be like that. And just as every time I fly to Israel, the tremendous security before you even get on the plane, a special basically wing of security you have to go through. It's sad because the world is so hatefully anti-Israel and anti-Semitic. It's sad that that is necessary, but that's the situation. And I never feel safer than when I am in Israel. I feel safer in Jerusalem than I do in New York City, LA, or Chicago. And I say that as a proud, patriotic American. There's just something about the security you feel in God's land, the land of Israel. And it doesn't hurt that everyone there performs military service, men and women alike, and they are at the ready. Sadly, they have to be, because they are surrounded on all sides by hateful enemies that want to eliminate the state of Israel. Okay, so now you have the situation in Syria overnight, the airstrikes. Let's see real quick some comments here. We've got over 1,000 people with us right now. Many more will join by the end. If you missed anything, remember this will be in our archives, the full newscast. If you're just joining us, you can catch the beginning. I'm just looking at some comments here real quick in our little scroll down area here. Stephen asks a good question. We're doing Q&A at the end, but has Russia replied in any way on these recent airstrikes? Not yet, Stephen, but that meeting next week between Putin and Bennett, certainly these Syrian airstrikes will be discussed. We need to move on to our next topic. Daniel is sending me along our producer Daniel sending along some questions from you all as well. So leave your questions. Be sure, remember, we're going to around 5 p.m. Eastern time. We've got plenty of time left. And at the end, we will devote the last 15 minutes or so to questions. Ask the Watchman. Ask me anything, and hopefully I can answer it. So moving on to the next topic. We've got several today. I mentioned as we're talking about airstrikes, how do you defend against airstrikes? Well, you do that through missile defense systems. And Israel, of course, has one of the most effective missile defense multi-layered systems in the world in the form of Iron Dome and David's Sling and the Arrow missile defense system, which Iron Dome focuses on shorter range rockets, David's Sling, medium range, the Arrow system, longer range, and it all works together beautifully to really provide a great defensive shield for the nation of Israel as these rockets rain down on a regular basis. And we do know, though, that Israel is carrying out strikes of its own through the air against Iran and its proxies, mainly in Syria. Well, now Iran says it has its own Iron Dome missile defense system, its version of Iron Dome. Did you catch this week? Iran conducted military drills Tuesday and Wednesday, October 12th and October 13th of this week, and much of it was apparently devoted to showing off their missile defense prowess, in their view at least, and how they would potentially shoot down any incoming rockets or perhaps fire at fighter jets from another country. Why are they doing this? Number one, the Iranian regime is trying to flex its muscle and show its military advancements. It's hubris, of course, and they want to give the impression that they can compete with Israel militarily. A big part of that is that drone program that Iran has now, right? Where they are showcasing their attack drones and using them in real time on a regular basis. They want to show off these homegrown drones and say, hey, we have advanced military technology and know-how to Israel. Now they're doing it with the missile defense system, trying to compete, and they just can't, but they're trying, and they were boasting about this missile defense. So one reason they're doing it is to give the impression that they are keeping pace with Israel and that they are the great Persian powerhouse. Secondly, though, let's face it, they are scared. Let's use that word. Scared, frightened. Iran's regime sitting in Tehran right now that their nuclear weapons facilities will eventually be targeted by Israel and Israeli strikes. Now, we've seen the sabotage again and again over the past year and a half. Iran's nuclear weapons facilities and ballistic missile factories struck with sabotage attacks on Iranian soil again and again. Talk about black eyes for the Iranian regime, embarrassment for the Iranian regime repeatedly over the past year and a half. But eventually, to completely eliminate that nuclear weapons program, which is growing by leaps and bounds by all accounts, there will need to be some sort of military action. No one wants to see that, clearly. But the Iranian regime continues to press with their nuclear weapons program. Israel cannot allow that, because if Iran gets the bomb, it will use the bomb to destroy the state of Israel. Folks, it's not brain surgery what I do. For instance, I look at the 20th century, the century of Mao, Hitler, Saddam, and Stalin. What that told me is that when evil men tell you they want to kill you, you should believe them and take them very seriously. So when Iran's mullahs talk constantly about wiping Israel off the map and are building the world's deadliest weapons, which would enable them to wipe Israel off the map, I take them at their word. I take them very seriously. I do not believe this is just bluster for domestic consumption from the Iranian regime. I believe they mean what they say. And guess what? Israeli leaders do too. And Israeli leaders can't really take a chance here, can they? If another nation, considering the history of the land of Israel and the Jewish people, if another nation is telling you they're going to destroy you and wipe you off the map, and they're equipping themselves with the weapons to do it, you kind of don't have any choice but to take them very seriously. All that said, where does that leave us? It leaves us with this fact that under no circumstances will Israel allow Iran to acquire nuclear weapons. Iran knows this deep down. That's why they are hardening these nuclear weapon sites deep underground, first. And second, this is why they're trying to bolster their missile defense, their air defense systems to shoot down any incoming fighter jets. And that's the situation we have right now. If they're looking for assistance on that front, Russia has been very eager to supply the Assad regime in Syria with all sorts of missile defense help. The S-300, S-400 advanced missile defense systems. Syria and Russia have been boasting in recent months that they have repelled Israeli attacks in Syria. So certainly, if Iran wants that kind of assistance, they can look to their friend in Moscow for that very kind of help. But another interesting story I wanted to discuss with you, the Iranian Iron Dome story that emerged this week. Hey, I mentioned that Lapid, Israel's foreign minister, Yair Lapid, and we'll get to Lebanon in a second, by the way. But I mentioned that Yair Lapid is in Washington, D.C. this week, meeting with Biden administration officials. Some interesting news over the past 24 hours. Lapid has been meeting with the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, a man that I'm not very impressed by, to say the least, in terms of his foreign policy posture. That's my view on this entire administration. We could go on about that. I made those feelings very clear during the Afghanistan debacle back in late August, but I digress. Blinken and Lapid had a very interesting conversation. And on Blinken's part, I don't feel that this was sincere, that he really means it, but I know that Lapid meant it. Lapid said, we talked about, quote, other options in dealing with Iran's nuclear program. What does that mean? Clearly, it means the military option, because Blinken and the Biden White House all along have been hell-bent on re-entering that disastrous Iran nuclear deal and reviving it from the dead where it belongs. President Trump, to his credit, pulled the U.S. out of that deal in May 2018. Now the Biden administration wants to revive it. Blinken has made it clear. Biden has made it clear. Israel says you're crazy. They're not saying that, but they're saying don't do it. Big mistake. Bennett and his administration are trying to remain and retain a cordial relationship with the Biden White House and be on the same page as much as possible. But clearly, they do not see eye to eye on the Iran nuclear deal. But now Blinken is at least paying lip service and saying, you know what? All options are on the table, and we will consider other options as well. Now, I hope that the government in Israel doesn't really take these guys at their word. I don't think they do. I think after the Afghanistan debacle, I don't think any of America's allies, or its enemies for that matter, are taking anything this White House says very seriously. I'm sure that Israel isn't as well, but it's at least good for Israel to get these folks on the record saying that they're going to consider the military option and other options, so Israel can say, hey, and hold their feet to the fire when the rubber hits the road, and when Israel is perhaps eventually forced to act. So that was interesting to see Lapid push. And Lapid was in Moscow last month. Bennett's going to Russia next week. Lapid was in Moscow meeting with his Russian counterpart, the foreign minister there, Sergei Lavrov. And Lapid delivered a similar message. Folks, if you're reading the tea leaves, so to speak, and you're monitoring the statements out of the Israeli government, in particular from the three most pivotal players, the Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, the Foreign Minister, Yair Lapid, and the Defense Minister, Benny Gantz, all of them are in lockstep here in saying we will not allow Iran to acquire the bomb. All options are on the table, including the military option. The Chief of Staff for the Israel Defense Forces, Aviv Kohavi, is saying the same thing. All options are on the table. We will act alone if we need to. And oh, by the way, Iran is very, very close to acquiring the bomb, and they're enriching uranium at an alarming rate that puts them very close to a nuclear breakout. All three of Israel's top officials are saying this on practically a daily basis. Is everyone out there listening? Israel's telling the world, look, if you don't handle this existential threat, this threat to our very existence as a nation and a people, we're going to handle it. Never again means never again. And there's a lot of agreement across pretty much the ideological spectrum in Israel. They don't agree on much, but on the Iranian nuclear threat, there's a lot of agreement. You'd be surprised. So stay tuned there. We'll see how these meetings wrap up. The other thing we need to talk about, let's see, Daniel is sending some good questions here as well, folks. I'm just glancing down at my phone for a second to see what we have. I wanted to get into Lebanon, of course, and before hey, we're getting close to Q&A, actually, so keep the questions coming too. We're getting there shortly, but I wanted to talk about Lebanon. The situation in Lebanon right now is really devolving into hell on earth, and I'm sad to say that. I mentioned at the top how Israel Hmm, Lebanon. I'm sorry. It's Israel's northern neighbor. But the situation in Lebanon, certainly a hell on earth situation right now. I'm sad to say that because it is a nation of immense natural beauty, great history, great culture. Love the people of Lebanon. But, folks, it looks like that country is teetering right now on the brink of civil war once again. Today, October 14th, 2021, in Beirut, Hezbollah, the Iran backed terror group, Iran's most lethal proxy, along with a group called Amal, that's AMAL, another Shia movement, which in former years, the 80s, early 90s, was much stronger than it is now. It's an ally of Hezbollah, but make no mistake about it, Hezbollah is the big dog when it comes to Hezbollah and when it comes to southern Lebanon and Shia jihad in Lebanon. Hezbollah held this protest rally along with Amal today in the streets of Beirut. And why were they protesting? Well, there is a judge in Lebanon, God bless him, named Tariq Bitar, Bitar, and he is holding Hezbollah's feet to the fire quite literally. He's leading an investigation over the Beirut port blast, which occurred last August 2020. You all remember those images. It looked literally like a mushroom cloud over the city of Beirut, the Lebanese capital. A massive stockpile of ammonium nitrate that was being stored at the port of Beirut. It should not have been there, but it went up in flames, killed hundreds of people, wounded thousands of more, wreaked havoc in downtown Beirut and the port area, economic disaster for the nation of Lebanon, from which they still have not recovered. That happened in August 2020, and now there's a probe being led by this judge, Tariq Bitar. He's 47 years old, and he is saying to Hezbollah, he's questioning Hezbollah leaders, members of Lebanon's parliament, who are Hezbollah members and leaders as well. And he's saying, hey, we're going to do a fair and thorough investigation. Part of that investigation is that you, Hezbollah, need to be brought in for some questioning. And I want to ask you some questions, again, to this judge's eternal credit. Again, there are still many theories on what happened in August 2020 at the port of Beirut. But what seems pretty clear is that there was some kind of Hezbollah involvement. Hezbollah did not intentionally ignite the fireworks at the port of Beirut, but there was certainly a mishandling there. But that was explosive material that it appears that Hezbollah was overseeing. They were basically guarding it for future use. Did Hezbollah have that massive stockpile at the port of Beirut in terms of future terror attacks, in terms of using it, I should say, in future terror attacks, mainly against Israel, of course, to the south of Lebanon? At any rate, that stockpile went up in the horrific mushroom cloud scene and caused massive damage. And now Hezbollah is saying to this judge, Tariq Bitar, we won't talk to you. And not only that, Hezbollah is saying we want him removed from the investigation because he dares question us. He's unfairly targeting Hezbollah, according to Hezbollah, and they want him removed. And that's why Hezbollah and its various radical allies took to the streets of Beirut today to rally against this judge, who I'm sure is concerned for his life right now. But this rally quickly devolved into chaos, folks. Gunfire broke out between Hezbollah. Hezbollah says it was Christian militias who were behind all of it, but there was a violent clash there in Beirut. 6 people were killed. As I come to you Thursday afternoon, Eastern time here in the States, the numbers may rise as we go on throughout the day, but so far, 6 people killed, at least 30 more wounded, and a country on edge right now in Lebanon. This is no surprise. Everything Hezbollah and by extension its patron Iran touch turns to misery and turns to chaos. Think about all the nations, folks, where Iran has its claws in across the Middle East. Lebanon, of course, Yemen with the Houthis, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza, Iraq with the Shia militias, Syria with Assad and the Shia militias and Hezbollah. What do all five of these areas have in common? All of them are literally living under hellish conditions right now, complete chaos. Syria, Iraq, and Yemen have basically ceased to be nation states. And a big reason why is the Iranian influence in those countries. They have essentially become Iranian satellites. The Iranian regime brings misery, chaos, violence, and death, no matter where it goes, across the Middle East and across the world. Not the Iranian people, not the Iranian people who are the main victims of this regime. It's the regime that is the problem. Quick last note on Lebanon. Talk about a bad year. And I talked about these other nations ceasing to be nation states. Could Lebanon be next? We had obviously horrific civil war and sectarian strife there throughout the 1970s, 80s, and into the 90s. And now we have Shia versus Christian versus Sunni there in Lebanon once again, with Hezbollah, the trigger, surprise, surprise, for all of it. And talk about bad timing, as Lebanon is just racked by massive political instability. A new president came to the forefront about a month ago. Right away, he slammed Israel in his public statements, but that government is very shaky and teetering on the brink. Economic chaos. People are literally starving in Lebanon right now. That's how bad it is. Unemployment massively through the roof. I believe it's at 50 or 60%. The last time I checked, you've got a lot of unemployed young men wandering the streets, a nasty situation, a toxic situation. And oh, by the way, last weekend, Lebanon went dark for 24 hours straight, a complete blackout in that nation due to fuel shortages. Of course, Iran and Hezbollah are swooping in with fuel and gas shipments, trying to play the role of savior. But at the end of the day, it's going to be a very different role that they play. They could be the forces, Iran and Hezbollah, that drive Lebanon again into civil war. I pray that is not the case. Lebanon's a beautiful country with a great and proud history and some great people in Lebanon. We pray that's not the case, but until Lebanon sheds itself of its Hezbollah problem, I believe the chaos will continue in that nation. By the way, right to Israel's north. Quick programming note on that note, tonight on TBN, talk about timing for tonight's program, the Watchman TV show. Now, if you love the newscast, by the way, we're getting to questions in 2 minutes. Keep them coming. I have a bunch on the phone that Daniel sent. We've got a bunch coming now. So we're going to have a good chunk of time here for questions. Tonight's program on TBN, it's the world's largest Christian television network. If you don't live in the States, and many of our viewers don't, you can watch it, clips from the show here on our YouTube channel. And of course, go to TBN's website, tbn.org. Just type in The Watchman. You can find all the episodes there. 210 episodes under our belts. Hard to believe. But if you love the newscast, you'll love our 30-minute weekly TV show. We are on the ground in Israel and Iraq and Jordan and points across the Middle East, bringing you on the ground firsthand coverage. And tonight, 10 p.m. Eastern time, we are in a Hezbollah terror tunnel. Now, this show originally aired in July, but I think a lot of people were on holiday, on summer vacation, so we want to re-air it tonight. And what timing? With everything going on in Lebanon, we will take you inside tonight, a Hezbollah terror tunnel. Don't miss it on TBN, 10 p.m. Eastern time. Rebroadcast tomorrow, Friday, at 6:30 p.m. Eastern time. Okay, question time. Here we go. Let's see here. Daniel sending them. Pardon me as I look down at the phone. Daniel sending. I didn't share that testimony story that I said I would talk about. There is a scar on my head. I don't know if you could see it right here. but there is a scar on my head, and I wanted to tell you how I got that scar and how it actually helped me grow in my faith. In TV, we call that a teaser. Perhaps on next week's live stream, we'll get into that. There was so much news to talk about today that I didn't have time, but I'd like to share from time to time those testimony stories because a lot of the news, let's be honest, folks, it's doom and gloom, right? Where do we get encouragement? I find encouragement in the Word of God and in what God is doing in people's lives. I know what He's done in my life. He took me out of nowhere. He saved me quite literally. And I have a duty from God Almighty to share all of that with you. So whenever I can drop in some personal stories, they'll encourage you and you'll say, wow, okay, all is not lost. God is still on the throne. Not only that, He has an active, everyday, 24/7 part in my life, in all of our lives as individuals. So, how did I get the scar? Which can you see? I don't get too close and scare you. Little scar there. The one of the God things I guess I would say about it is you can barely see the scar. There's a good story behind this. That's your teaser for next week's live stream. But we need to get into questions. What do we have here? We've got about 19 minutes for questions. This is awesome. Let's see. Okay. Anthony asks, what is the time frame on Iran's uranium enrichment? Are we weeks away, months away, years away from Iran having the breakout? Good question. I'm glad you asked that. Sometimes the Iranian nuclear, the uranium enrichment, the centrifuges, it can get in the weeds, right? If you're like me, sometimes you're like, okay, in English, please tell me what this means. I've learned a lot and been educated about this over the years. Um, but here's the bottom line. Where are they with uranium enrichment? According to U.S. officials, including the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, according to Israel's Defense Minister, Benny Gantz, according to various Israeli military figures, they seem to believe that Iran is within 10 weeks, about 2 months, under 3 months, of having enough enriched uranium to acquire a nuclear bomb. We've been hearing for weeks now. This has been the consensus that if Iran so chooses, they could break out within 2 months. Have they chosen? That's the big question, right? If they so choose, it's always got that caveat. If Iran wants to, they can do this in relatively short order. So, folks, you kind of take the temperature here of the situation. I like to say that time is short. Well, this current Iranian government, they may decide that they do want to break out. I don't think it would shock anyone watching if they walked away from that negotiating table where apparently at the beginning of next month in Vienna, the Iranian regime is once again going to meet with U.S. officials, at least indirectly in Vienna, to revive the Iran nuclear deal. Would not shock me if Iran said, forget about it, walked away and broke out in terms of saying, we're driving for the bomb. We're doing this. Why shouldn't we do it now when we have weak leadership in the United States? When we have new leadership in Israel, which is untested, we don't know yet, but we have weak leadership without a doubt from the leader of the nation that served as a leader of the free world for so long, uncertain leadership in Israel. Let's do it now. This is our golden opportunity, Iran might be saying, to break out and get the bomb. Who's going to stop us? And I can assure you, folks, that Russia, China, North Korea, Turkey, various terror groups are saying the same thing in the wake of what just unfolded in Afghanistan and the United States running like it did. Not U.S. soldiers, the U.S. leadership, not the brave American soldiers, the leadership running like it did and leaving allies behind, leaving Americans behind. I could go on with that. It's still a very fresh wound, as you can tell, especially if you're an American. Okay, let's move on. But Iran close, and we talked earlier about possible Israeli strike against Iran's nuclear facilities. Again, you do the math. If we're saying 2 months till breakout, now that's if Iran decides to do it. Iran could decide 10 months from now we're going to break out. So that would put us at a year from now. You do the math. You get it. Okay, more questions here. We have the scroll going on. This is great. Is Raj Sinj asks, is Iran capable of the destruction of Israel? What a question. Folks, that's a great question, right? Iran talks about destroying Israel. Could Iran actually destroy Israel? Well, if Iran gets the bomb, of course. If Iran gets even one nuclear warhead and is able to mount it on a missile and fires it at, say, Tel Aviv, remember, some 70%, maybe even 75% of the Israeli population lives in and around the Tel Aviv metropolitan area near the coast, the Mediterranean coast. You are essentially the nation of Israel. It's not Israel in terms of a nation state anymore. If some 70% of the population lives around Tel Aviv, and God forbid, what a nightmare, hellish scenario. I don't even like to contemplate. No one does. Certainly no one in Israel. But if that happens, Israel, for all intents and purposes, ceases to exist. Here's the good news. We've read the book and we know it's not going to happen, but I'm answering the question. Clearly, if Iran had the nuclear option, yes, it could destroy Israel if it had the bomb. But secondly, even with a non-nuclear option, Iran's other strategy here in terms of making the destruction of Israel, their great ideological goal, a reality, would be to activate that ring of fire that we've talked so much about here in the Watchman Newscast. Israel surrounded right now on all sides by rockets and missiles and explosive-laden drones, whether it's Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Yemen, Gaza, surrounded on all sides. If Iran activates that ring of fire and tens of thousands of rockets and missiles start raining down on Israeli cities, and Iron Dome and David Sling and the Arrow system, as great as those missile defense systems are, they won't be able to get all of them, especially if Iran and Hezbollah are using these precision-guided missiles. They might not, if that happened, that scenario, they may not destroy Israel, but certainly they would do major, major damage. So that's the two strategies. Iran is committed to this ideological goal of destroying the state of Israel. Folks, make no mistake about it. They are committed to this. It's the pillar of their regime and their main ideological goal. The two strategies they had to do that, really, let's say three. Number one, nuclear. Number two, activate the ring of fire, surround Israel on all sides. And number three, I would say, political jihad, the economic jihad against Israel in terms of making Israel an international pariah and isolating Israel on the world stage. Iran wants to help do that as well. You've heard of the BDS movement, boycott, divest from, and sanction Israel. Well, Iran, needless to say, is a big fan of that as well. Will they destroy Israel? No, they will not. It's not going to end well for the Iranian regime. That's why everyone watching this right now should take heart and be encouraged. Israel wins in the end. It's not going to be pretty. There's going to be battles and wars and lives lost. It's horrific to even contemplate, but in the end, the nation of Israel will be standing. But again, it's going to be very difficult getting there. In the meantime, we know, we've read the book, but what we do know is it's not going to end well for Israel's enemies, to say the least. Hey, I dropped my phone. Let me pick it up because I have more questions coming to you. I'm back. Okay, let's see what else we have. That was a good question. We talk so much about Iran threatening to destroy Israel. Can they actually do it? That was a great question. Okay, let's keep them coming. We have about 10 minutes left. Let's see. Sorry for the pause. I'm just looking for a good question here. Hey, someone asked, Eric, I'm looking to move to Israel soon. Do you know of any good suburbs outside of Jerusalem to move to? I want to make Aliyah. I love Mevaseret. Mevaseret is a great area outside of Jerusalem. I'm an American. A lot of American transplants actually live in Mevaseret, but I'd recommend Mevaseret. It's a great, great area outside of Jerusalem, family friendly as well. Okay, and good luck in your Aliyah. Let's see. Let's see what we have. Keep them coming. Hey, congrats to someone. I think everyone's going to like this. Pankaj, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, Pankaj Sharma. He says, please, all people in this chat room, please pray for my mother to be healed. I was once Hindu, now I believe in Christ, and my faith grows stronger every day. Number one, God bless you, Pankaj, and let's pray for his mom, right, who needs healing. Formerly Hindu, now he's a Christian. That's an awesome story. Thank you for sharing that. That is an encouragement. Is there anything we can do? The average American, someone asks. Deborah asks, is there anything we can do to help the Lebanese people? That's a good question. I think of number one, groups like Samaritan's Purse, Franklin Graham's group, incredible group. I think of Operation Blessing, which is connected to CBN, the Christian Broadcasting Network, which go on the ground in disaster areas. Are they doing that right now in Lebanon? Good question. I would check out their sites, Operation Blessing and Samaritan's Purse. That's off the top of my head. Mercy Ships is another great organization doing humanitarian work. I wonder if Voice of the Martyrs is doing some work there for the persecuted Christians in Lebanon. Look, still a strong Christian population there, Maronite Christians, but increasingly facing persecution by the likes of Hezbollah. Obviously, that's one way. Prayer is the biggest way. Absolutely. Keep praying. Keep the people of Lebanon in your prayers. Government to government, it's interesting because obviously the U.S. has a relationship with the Lebanese government, but this Lebanese government is basically a figurehead right now and doesn't have much teeth and is cobbled together and might not be very long for this world. I'm not saying their lives, but I'm saying the government. So right now, I would say look into any independent aid groups you can. If you want to help the people of Lebanon, there are so many great nonprofit groups out there, like a Samaritan's Purse, like an Operation Blessing, that are helping people in hot spots and trouble spots and in chaotic, devastated places around the world. So definitely look into that. That might be your best bet. And also pray. You know, it's interesting. I was interviewing someone recently for a special I did about China and the rise of China and that threat. That's a whole story there. But we got into the persecuted church in China. We talked a lot about it. And I said, what can we do? I asked what you asked. And he said, pray. But it almost sounds cliched, right? We need to pray. He said, I'm not just going to say, just pray for them. Yes, pray for them. But this really stuck with me, folks. He said, pray for the persecuted church the way you would want to be prayed for. If you were in a cell in China right now or Iran and being tortured and deprived of food and water, how would you want people around the world to pray for you? I thought that was a very, very important question. I hadn't thought about it like that before. He said, what if you were in their shoes? They all covet prayer. He said the main thing he hears from persecuted believers around the world is pray for us. They know that prayer works. They know the power of prayer. But how would you want to be prayed for if you were in a dire situation? So when I tell you to pray for the people of Lebanon, put yourself in their shoes right now. Economic devastation, unemployment, family going hungry, the possibility of civil war at your doorstep, an unstable government, terror groups like Hezbollah roaming and prowling. How would you want to be prayed for if you were just a good, hardworking, decent person living under those conditions? So maybe that'll give some guidance there on how we can pray. Let's look for some more questions here. Let's see. Is the Magog region in Afghanistan? That's a good question. The Gog-Magog war we talked about at the top, the book of Ezekiel, chapters 38 and 39, talks about this last days confederation that comes against Israel. Again, key point here, Ezekiel says it will be in the latter days that this coalition comes against Israel. Is Afghanistan part of that confederation? Very good question. In my view, Iran, Turkey, and Russia are at the head of it. But many prophecy and scholars and biblical prophecy scholars, I should say, believe that the stands, some of those Central Asian nations, former Soviet republics, will also be part of that confederation force. Will Afghanistan be one of them, which actually kicked the Soviets out, I should say, Afghanistan. But is this new turn? What is there? Many people were talking about this about a month ago, and we did as well here on the Watchman Newscast. What are the prophetic implications for what just went down in Afghanistan, for the Taliban ruling that country once again? Will there be a turn of a Taliban ruled Afghanistan to the Iranian regime? The two have not gotten along over the years, but now it seems like there are friendlier relations. Could Afghanistan, under the Taliban, hop on board this last days confederation against Israel as part of the Gog Magog confederation? It's possible. I would say right now, unlikely, because they're trying to get their act together right now. I mean, it's complete chaos in that nation. The Taliban just came to power, and sadly, what they will try to do before anything, certainly I would think before any exterior military operations, would be to stabilize the country under their brutal rule. So what you're going to see, sadly, is reprisal killings and the Taliban taking out any and all enemies and any and all people who worked with the US and the previous Afghan government. So that's what they're busy doing now. Before they set their sights on any foreign operations, they're busy consolidating power in Afghanistan. Ultimately, could they be part of this invasion force? Perhaps, but I certainly think there were prophetic implications for what went down in Afghanistan. I think most of all, it made, whether Afghanistan is part of that force or not, it made the Ezekiel 38 and 39 war much more likely. The word I've been using on the newscast is accelerate. We've seen an acceleration in the plans of the likes of Iran and Russia and China and the Taliban. So it accelerated devious plans. I would say what happened in Afghanistan, because the world's worst actors said, no one's going to stand in our way. Right now, if a group of nations gathered on Israel's borders and threatened to invade, led by Russia, a powerful nation, and led by Turkey, which has a powerful military, and Iran, which is no slouch militarily, what would the Biden administration do? Based on what we just saw in Afghanistan, what do you think they would do? Are you really confident that they would aid Israel? Other than maybe a UN resolution condemning the confederation that comes against Israel? I think that remains to be seen, to say the least. I'm not too confident or optimistic about it. And I think the enemies of Israel know that very well. Again, the combination of weak leadership in America and an Israeli government, which is untested. I'm not saying anything. So far, they're saying the right things, and they've done the right things in the foreign policy realm, in my view. They've continued the airstrikes against Iran and its various proxies in Syria and elsewhere. So, but untested in terms of a real major crisis right now, the current Israeli government. So the bad guys could probe and test and take the measure of this new Israeli government. They've taken the measure of the Biden administration, and we've seen how that's turned out. So emboldened, to say the least. Hey, we're going to run in about a minute. Let's see if we have time for one more question. I'm looking here. Let's see. Why don't Israelis fight their own wars? We have a good troll there, a Tom Andico. Well, Tom, Israel does fight its own wars, but like every nation, Israel has allies with common interests, like the United States, that share a certain outlook in the world, that believe in freedom and stand against radical Islamists like the Iranian regime. So when you have a situation like this, kind of like you had in World War II. Why didn't Britain fight its own war? Why didn't France fight its own war? Well, because we are similar-minded people. And if Israel was eliminated, and it's not going to happen, does anyone watching really think that the bad guys would stop there? If Israel was eliminated and they got their wishes, where would they go next? Where do you think they would go next? Would they be satisfied with just wiping Israel off the map? Would they pack up their bags and go home? I don't think so. I think next they are coming to the West, where you likely live. So hopefully that answers your question. The roots between the U.S. and Israel are very deep. Israel's doing a very good job handling itself. Thank you very much. And at the end of the day, the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, neither slumbers nor sleeps. So take heart there. Thanks so much for joining us here on the newscast. Trying to think if there's anything else I need to mention, any more programming notes. We'll be doing one of these live streams every week now. I know what I wanted to mention. If you left a question here, good news, and I didn't get to it perhaps. We had a lot of them. Tomorrow's newscast, Friday, October 15th, we will answer a few questions at the end. So if I didn't get to it today, I may very well get to it tomorrow. Thanks so much for joining us here on the Watchman live stream. Until tomorrow, God bless you, and remember, never hold your peace.